Good afternoon, everybody. As modern environmental managers and scientists, the terrains we each navigate can feel challenging, difficult, and unpredictable. How do we know where we are or where we're going? Right now, if you want to know your exact location, your phone could tell you in an instant. The concept of longitude, though, it was actually this technological challenge that wasn't solved until 200 years ago because of the interdisciplinary efforts of geographers, explorers, astronomers, and even clockmakers in the 18th century.
We exist in a time of modern exploration. With that comes both opportunities and challenges. Technology and methods are rapidly advancing, allowing us to manage and understand land in previously unimaginable ways.
We also face an unpredictable and rapidly changing climate, which means we must be able to adapt to our environmental challenges. Like the longitude problem, we have the tools, but it's going to require interdisciplinary teams to use data and advanced planning appropriately to increase environmental resiliency.
Today, I'd like to welcome you to our panel, Navigating Landscapes, Using Data and Advanced Planning to Increase Environmental Resiliency.
Each word in our title has meaning in the context of our work. Now we'll take time to introduce ourselves and show you how those words fit within our work.
I'm Chloe Beaupre. I will be presenting on my Master's of Science in Ecology thesis research. And my thesis follows big game animals navigating their seasonal migrations across the landscape of Colorado. I've used GPS collar data from animals collared throughout the state to provide guidelines and advanced planning for practitioners to evaluate collar sample sizes, to map movements, identify critical habitat, and ultimately to increase environmental resiliency.
I'm Katherine Bickley. I'm a Master's in Environmental Management candidate. My project navigates wetlands and streams in the arid landscape of Western Colorado. I used ecological data to identify the need for restoration of these important ecosystems on the Cold Harbor Ranch. Through my work, I used advanced planning to lay the groundwork for wetland and stream restoration, which will promote the environmental resiliency of our limited water resources in the West.
And my name is Joshua Wiese, and I'm also in a Master of Environmental Management program. My project involved navigating the complexities of bison reintroduction while managing grassland bird habitat within a native tallgrass prairie and wet meadow system or landscape in central Nebraska. I used bison conservation literature to contextualize long-term data and research of the Crane Trust to create an advanced plan for managing bison herd to enhance environmental quality and contribute to the resiliency of bison recovery as a species. Each of us has a different approach for addressing our environmental challenges, and it takes rooms full of great minds and great abilities to solve great problems. The three of us are environmental managers and scientists who have utilized data to create plans that help ensure the resiliency of the environments we care about.
Whether looking at the state of Colorado, the grasslands of Nebraska, or the streams and meadows of the Gunnison Valley, it's easy to get lost in the complexity of environmental management, but data and planning can act as our guides.
And just so we don't get lost this afternoon, here's a little roadmap to give you an idea of what to expect for our panel. Each of us will present on our projects, followed by 5 minutes of questions for each individual. I'll be going first, followed by Katherine, and ending with Josh. And after questions for Josh wrap up, we will open up the discussion to give you all an opportunity to ask cross-cutting questions that connect our various projects. But we do ask that you please don't ask us any more about the history of longitude, because that is all we have. Thank you. Whoa, All right. For my thesis, I'm working with Colorado Parks and Wildlife to investigate how many GPS collars need to be deployed on mule deer, elk, and bighorn sheep projects throughout Colorado. Understanding where animals go is key to wildlife management, and mapping animal movements can identify critical habitat, impediments to movement, and conservation opportunities. GPS collar technology has improved significantly in the past 50 years since Monique the Space Elk here was first outfitted with that monstrosity of a satellite collar 50 years ago. Particularly in the last 2 decades, GPS collars have revolutionized our understanding of animal movements. There's been a ton of awesome migration research, and it was actually a National Geographic video about elk migrations in the Greater Yellowstone that inspired me to come back to grad school. I started out doing the MEM program. I'm now doing a dual master's. So I finished up the MEM last spring, and for my MS in ecology thesis, I'm really diving into the science of migration. So it's been really exciting for me that this is what I'm researching. And I also just want to give you all a warning that it's about to get real sciencey, so buckle up. That being said, despite all of the migration research that's going on right now, there has been little focus in the migration literature on understanding how variation in migratory behaviors influences how many individuals need to be collared to map their migrations, which leaves biologists without a whole lot of guidance around this question when they're designing a study. For researchers and for grant decision makers who have limited budgets, appropriate sample sizes need to be assured so that money is used strategically while also generating valid population level inferences. In addition to fiscal concerns, it's of the utmost importance for animal welfare that as few animals as possible are subject to the stress and risks that are associated with capturing collaring. So our primary question is how many GPS collars need to be deployed to map population level spatial extent parameters like migration corridors and seasonal range. Determining sufficient sample sizes for GPS collar projects that are focused on mapping these population level spatial extent parameters is tricky for social herding species like mule deer, elk, and bighorn because the degree of home range overlap in sociality is not determinable. Basically, because animals are hanging out and sharing space on the landscape, it results in this asymptotic response that needs to be accounted for when determining appropriate sample sizes. Our objectives are to assess sample size adequacy for mapping population migration corridors, seasonal or core herd ranges. Through this study, we'll develop sample size guidelines for planning GPS collar studies that are focused on mapping these population level metrics because we're biologists with tools like statistics and we aren't fortune tellers who have crystal balls. And for those of you who haven't taken stats since high school, good job at being much less nerdy than me. But I just want to highlight that this little N up here stands for sample size, and you'll just keep seeing that throughout my study. So N equals sample size. To accomplish our objectives, we've coordinated an effort to bring GPS collar data from biologists across the state to a centralized location. And then we go through and run migration analyses to map migration corridors and seasonal range for every data set. Currently, GPS collar data is stored around the state and it's managed by individual wildlife biologists who store, organize, and analyze the data for their local needs. So we are collaborating with the State of Colorado Wildlife Movement Coordinator to compile all of these data sets. And a statewide protocol for managing GPS collar data has not yet been established in Colorado. And so the data come to me in all different kinds of formats. Some are in mapped shape files, some are spreadsheets with latitude, longitude coordinate systems, while others use UTMs. It's just all different. And you can imagine I've had a lot of fun getting all of these data organized and reformatting them so that they all play nicely with one another and I can run my analyses. This is the state of Colorado, and in red is the game management units where we have elk GPS collar data. These are the game management units where we have bighorn sheep data, and there are less bighorn than elk in Colorado, and so with less animals, there are just less data available. And these are the game management units where we have mule deer data. And for deer, we're also collaborating with the state of Utah, and they've actually already processed migration corridors on all of their data, and they were incredibly generous and willing to just share all of this processed data with my project, which was incredibly nice of them. So our data set includes location information from around 2,500 animals with more than 3 million locations. Our earliest data come from mule deer that were collared by the Southern Ute Indian tribe in 2004. And now that you all know how much data I'm working with, I can break the news that I'm not defending my thesis until this summer. And so this research is still in progress. So once we've got the data in hand, there are two main steps that you have to go through to go from having just 1 million location points and turning them into those cool migration maps that you might have seen in the news. So first, we need to separate out the migratory movements from the more normal movements. And then we can model utilization. So it's not just straight line sequences between points, but we can actually estimate the area that was used during migration. To determine migration timing, we use this graph of displacement over time. So displacement measures the distance from a starting location, which in this case is winter range. So that is shown there on the XY grid, and that would be over here on the displacement profile. Migratory animals will display a movement curve that's hump-shaped like this, where displacement increases at the start of spring migration as the animal moves to a distinct summer range. It plateaus while the animal is on its summer range, and then displacement decreases as the animal moves back to winter range in the fall. So we go through and we visually inspect each animal's annual displacement profile to set migration start and end dates for each collared animal to separate out those migratory movements, which are what's in color, and what will be used to develop migration corridors. So what this looks like is we start out with a bunch of location points. We go through and estimate migration timing to pull out those migration sequences. And then once we have the migration only movements, we can use the Brownian bridge movement model. And this model estimates the probability of use between sequential locations. And we run the Brownian bridge movement model for each individual animal for each year that it was monitored, which are then aggregated to create population level migration range. This approach to corridor mapping produces a pixelated utilization distribution map where each pixel represents its relative probability of use, which allows us to estimate how many individuals might have used any particular pixel during their migration. And these layers can be overlaid with other map layers and used to identify conservation opportunities, like where you might want to limit development or where to build a highway overpass. So this is what a bunch of processed migration ranges looks like for individual animals. And then to get the population migration range, you just stack and average all of these individual migrations. And here's what that looks like for one data set. This is one herd of elk, and that includes 53 individuals and 7 years of data. But we wondered what it would look like if we'd only had half the budget and we could have only deployed 26 collars rather than 53. So that is what is shown on the right. And to be honest, they don't look too different, but I think what's really interesting is how this estimate varies based on which half of the sampled population you pull the data for. This map hasn't stabilized, which indicates that half the sampled population would not have been adequate to map those population level corridors. The next question we had was what it would look like if we had only deployed collars for 1 year. And that is shown on the right. That is 2015 with 18 individuals and 34 seasonal migrations. And you can see that we're missing all of these movements in the southern portion of the unit, and the footprint's just a lot smaller. If we follow those same 18 individuals for 2 years, we have a different picture of the overall population migration range. And there's this really cool movement that crosses down in the southeast, and that actually crosses over the continental divide. And we would have missed that entirely had it only been a 1-year study. So there are all sorts of ways to slice and dice the data, which is what I'm doing for my research. We're using rarefaction, which is basically just simulating reduced data to evaluate the consequences of smaller sample size. We have developed a code that runs this rarefaction method to randomly sample all combinations of individuals. And then for all of the different sample sizes and simulations, we can calculate the area of the mapped extent in square kilometers. This allows us to plot the area of the estimated corridor as a function of number of animals collared. Here, sample size is shown on the x-axis, and these blue lines represent the cumulative range extent when randomly adding in collared elk, starting with a sample size of 1. Whether or not these curves level off indicates whether animal sample size was sufficient. This example is 1 year of elk data in one study area, and you can see that the curve does not level off, which means that in that year, we did not have enough data to adequately map population level corridors, and you wouldn't want to use those maps to decide where to put an expensive highway overpass. Fortunately, in that study area, we've had collars deployed for 5 years, and so you can see over time we have reached this leveling off, which indicates that those mapped corridor estimates are robust, and those maps should be used for making those important management decisions. We can also use these accumulation curves to predict sample sizes for future studies. We can use the rate of increase in area as the response variable to model these curves as a function of variables that can be known by biologists or controlled prior to starting a GPS collar study. We can use the coefficient estimates from this model to create a tool where biologists can input these variables to estimate collar sample sizes, to produce sample size guidelines for future studies that are dynamic, and they're actually based on known study area parameters, which is much better than just general rule of thumb numbers. These guidelines can be used statewide to determine appropriate GPS collar sample sizes to generate empirical research while balancing financial and ethical concerns to ultimately advance science-based conservation and wildlife management, which is the goal. I want to thank my thesis committee and especially Kevin Blecka for having such an awesome research idea and working with me on another project. Huge thank you to all the regional biologists and field technicians who captured, collared, and monitored these animals and were willing to share their hard-earned data with me. And thank you to all of our collaborators and our funders, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'm excited to hear your questions.
We have time for a few questions. Go for it.
Two is plenty of questions.
Can you
for me
repeat the question?
Yeah, I was going to say 2 is plenty of questions for me to remember and repeat back. So the first question is whether I was involved in any capture and collaring, and I have helped with a handful, but not enough. I would love to have more of that experience. The second question is how long an animal will wear a GPS collar, and that really depends on the questions that the study is asking and the collar brand and like how often a GPS collar is taking locations. So some GPS collars will take a location every hour, and those collars won't last as long because the battery dies quicker. But other collars will take like 1 or 2 fixed locations a day, and those can last a very long time, like 5 years maybe, depends. But yeah, thank you.
Chris K on Zoom would like to know, are female ungulates only used for collaring, or are there any males collared?
It again depends on the study area and the question. For some of our data sets, we have male data, but it's definitely more common to collar females because they're more influential on, well, it's thought that they're more influential on population abundance.
All right, one more question. Yeah.
That's a great question. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Like some of the guidelines out there for how many animals to collar are seriously like 30 animals, which doesn't take into account like population abundance or anything, you know, like it really does depend on the species and on the study area. Like For a herd of elk, that's like 500,000 animals, you know, like 30 animals is going to maybe be wildly insufficient, but for like a bighorn sheep population that's really small, 30 animals could actually be like a large proportion of its population. And so that's exactly what I'm trying to figure out. Good question, if I do say so myself. Thank you. And now I'm handing it over to Katherine.
Hi. Just again, I'm Katherine Bickley. I'm a Master's in Environmental Management candidate, as well as the Cold Harbor Institute Water Resources Fellow. Today I'll be speaking about my project, Stream and Wetland Restoration on the Cold Harbor Ranch. So today I'm going to start by just providing an overview of the Cold Harbor Institute. I'm going to speak a bit about the goals and objectives of my project, go through my process, and then discuss my final products as well as some next steps for this project. So the Cold Harbor Institute is a local nonprofit, which is located about 7 miles east of downtown Gunnison. They manage this 334-acre ranch, and 243 acres of the ranch are managed under an NRCS Wetland Reserves Program, or WRP, conservation easement, which means that this property is protected in perpetuity. The property is home to the confluence of the Cochetope and the Tomichi Creeks. The Tomichi Creek, there's about a 2.5-mile long reach of the creek that's contained within the property. And the Tomichi eventually flows into the Gunnison River. And millions of years ago, the Gunnison River is what formed the valley that most of us are in today. And the Gunnison River continues to be really important to our valley. It sustains life here, even in modern times, through agriculture, livestock, recreation, and bringing revenue to our valley. The Gunnison River, eventually near Grand Junction, flows into the Colorado River, which is hugely important for many people living in the southwestern US in terms of agriculture, drinking supply, etc. And this is really all to illustrate that even smaller scale stream and ecological restoration projects can have positive impacts and repercussions, not only for the communities they are located in, but for much larger regions as well. Responsible management of water and environmental resources is important across the country, but especially here in our headwater communities, in which our actions affect so many and so much that's downstream of us. The Tomichi is important not only to humans, it's also really key fish habitat. And there's gold medal trout populations on the Cold Harbor Ranch, and fishing is an important source of revenue for the organization. And some of our fish species are very sensitive to degraded conditions. And so some of our restoration looks to target this fish habitat. Shown here in the bottom right-hand corner is a pool and riffle sequence, which is really important for fish, not something that we can target with our restoration. Some of our fish species also require specific kind of chemical parameters in terms of an acceptable range of pH, dissolved oxygen, and then also making sure that our in-stream temperatures, especially during warmer months, aren't becoming too warm and they're still hospitable to fish. The Tomichi and the adjacent wetlands are also very important to wildlife here in our valley. Our conservation easement specifically targets migrating waterfowl, but additionally, the property is incredibly important for deer and elk and other mammals in our valley. So in addition to the Tomichi, the property also houses these incredible wetlands. And here in Colorado, only 3% of our state is made up of wetlands, yet they house over 75% of our plant biodiversity. So these really incredible, really productive ecosystems. Additionally, there's some really neat interactions that occur between the creek on our property and the wetlands. The wetlands really act as a sponge, and so during periods of really high seasonal flows, the wetlands can help to absorb some of this excess flow and prevent flooding and prevent damage to infrastructure or property or structures. And then kind of inversely, during periods of drought, those wetlands can again act as a sponge, and they can help to maintain our water table and our in-stream flows. Wetlands are also incredible at water filtration, and the Cold Harbor property is adjacent to Highway 50. There's some runoff coming from the highway, and the wetlands are really great at filtering out not only pollutants, but they also slow that runoff so that sediment filters out, and that prevents that sediment from entering into our waterways. And then lastly, wetland plants have really amazing root systems that are really great at stabilization and holding on to soil and preventing erosion of our banks along the creek. So I'm going to speak now a little bit to the goals and objectives of my project. Wetlands are very key. The Cold Harbor property, like a lot of the land in Gunnison, has a history of a lot of varied use. There's 2 parallel rail lines that run through the property, and those kind of raised earth features have caused disruptions to natural surface water flows, and as a result, that's dewatered some of our wetlands and facilitated some upland conversion. So we're looking at revitalizing or creating new wetlands on the property, especially through the use of low-tech process-based restoration methods. Another goal here relates to the Tamichi Creek, and we're looking at dealing with erosion and some in-stream challenges. The Tamichi Creek, kind of looking at historical data, would have been a very active stream, which would have been able to laterally migrate across the valley floor. But due to some of these disruptions I've talked about, like the construction of Highway 50 or the rail lines, the stream is now kind of facing some barriers to natural migration. And as a result of that, there can be channelization or erosion or a lack of floodplain connectivity. And then the last goal here is to increase fish and wildlife habitat through some of that in-stream habitat I mentioned, as well as working to enhance and reestablish our riparian zones. I'm going to walk you guys through my process now. My project began with a site analysis, and then I went through an iterative design process. And finally, that process culminated in a series of final maps and final designs, as well as a scoping document. So to begin my site analysis, one piece of data I looked at was historic aerial imagery. This is courtesy of the NRCS Gunnison office. And this is really interesting to look at because you can really see how a system has evolved and changed throughout time. And these are all geo-referenced to the Cold Harbor property. I also looked at LiDAR data, which is light detection and ranging, which is a method of remote sensing in which pulsed laser beams of light are sent to the surface and they create this surface model, which again is a really valuable tool to look at what the surface of your area looks like and maybe what historically flows or surface water looked like. I also performed an on-the-ground site analysis in which I looked at notable features and created an inventory. And a couple of things to note here are along Highway 50, there's a lot of points there, and that's where some of that erosion and threat to utilities and infrastructure is occurring. And then we also have a series of seasonal oxbows, which are really great candidates for restoration. So after my site analysis and compiling some preliminary designs, a restoration committee was brought together with members from the following organizations who are all subject matter experts at restoration in the valley and are really familiar with what practices are most likely to work here in our climate. And following a design review, I completed another set of designs, and then there was also a final site visit out at the property in which designs are kind of looked at in the field and ground truthed. I'm now going to walk you guys through some of my final designs and what those look like. Just to begin, this is an overview of the Cold Harbor property, and these are our existing conditions. And so there's 2 things to note here. Shown in yellow are those 2 parallel rail lines I mentioned. And even though the rail lines themselves are no longer there, you still have this built-up fill material, which is really affecting surface flow on the property. And then also shown in red are seasonal oxbows, which historically were meanders of the Tamichi, and they've now been abandoned from the main stem of the channel, but there's still these depressions in the land. And so Seasonally, they collect flow either through groundwater infiltration or through surface water, and they do fill intermittently. So kind of to begin, I broke the Cold Harbor property into 3 geographic phases, and my project also follows the sequence with phase 1 coming first and phase 3 being the final phase. Before I get into my designs, I'd like to just go ahead and define a couple of the terms that I'll be talking about today. Shown here on the bottom right-hand corner is a beaver dam analog, which is designed to mimic a natural beaver dam. And the purpose here is to spread the water across the landscape and slow down that flow. Berms and swales are also something I'll be talking about. They're both earthwork features, either a depression or an elevation. And those are designed to control how water flows across a landscape with the main intent of spreading that water into our wetlands and increasing the residency time. And then lastly, I'll be talking about in-stream structures, which are comprised either of wood or rock. Shown here in the bottom left-hand corner is a crossvein. And for the majority of these structures, the purpose is to divert really high energy, potentially scouring flows away from banks and into the center of the channel instead. And that also has a co-benefit of increasing bed form diversity. As you can see below this structure, there's a scour pool. So those can be really beneficial structures when they're employed properly. So to begin, this is phase 1 of the property with those existing features. And there are 2 proposed alternatives. Option A, shown here on the left, looks at installing a series of beaver dam analogs within that seasonal oxbow with the intent of increasing the amount of residency time that water is in the wetlands and hopefully revitalizing some of those meadow or wetland environments. Additionally, there's a series of swales in that upper right-hand corner, again, with the purpose of spreading that water across that area, which has become dewatered due to the presence of the highway. And then lastly, there's a berm with the same intent, just spreading that surface flow. And then over here on the right is option B, which is slightly more intensive. And that section of the Tamichi that's shown in yellow was historically straightened due to the construction of the bridge on the right-hand side. And so this option looks at diverting the Tamichi into a historic flow path identified with LiDAR and converting that abandoned channel back into a meadow, which it previously would have been. These are the existing conditions for phase 2. And phase 2 similarly employs beaver dam analogs and the seasonal oxbows with the addition of some of those in-stream structures that I mentioned designed to target some of the erosional issues. And then phase 3, the existing conditions are similar and the proposed methods are similar to what's talked about in phase 1 and phase 2, again with the beaver dam analogs and some of those in-stream wood and rock structures. So finally, these maps served as the basis for my scoping document, which additionally includes a timeline, including planning, preparation, construction, implementation, and monitoring, a budget for each phase and each alternative, and some materials which can be used when applying for funding, as well as some of these project management tools. In terms of next steps, phase 1 of my project is scheduled to begin construction in fall of 2022. I've also written a grant and secured funding for a phase 2 investigation, looking at some of those specific hydraulics along the highway. And then there's also monitoring ongoing at the ranch, primarily right now through our Colorado River Watch program. I'd like to acknowledge Western professors Dr. Dave Ellerbrook and Dr. Micah Russell, the Cold Harbor Institute, including Ralph Clark, MJ Pickett, and Hannah Shaker-Tibbett, and the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions from the audience. Matthew? Never mind. Yeah.
Sure, just to repeat the question, Andrew asked, with the different phases of the project, why I've chosen to begin upstream as opposed to downstream. And I'd say that that's really dictated by the conditions on the ground. We're really looking at prioritizing that low-tech process-based wetland restoration, and that east pasture seemed like the best candidate. We have kind of a ditch inflow coming in at the top of that pasture, and so it's a really great opportunity that we have that water there right now, and we can really effectively work to spread that water and revitalize that area. And the hope is that this phase one can serve as kind of a lessons learned for the rest of the project. And so this is really approachable. We have really great on the ground conditions. We'll kind of begin here, hopefully learn some lessons with our tactics, and then apply these to later phases. Yeah, absolutely. That was another great question. And the question was specifically with phase one, looking at option A versus option B, is there kind of a quantification of ecological lift to compare those two alternatives? And I wish that I had more time to present today because that is in my report. And I did look at some metrics, including the increase of linear stream footage and the increase in sinuosity we would add to the system and some more specific metrics. But I think that's definitely important when looking at the two alternatives, is trying to do kind of a cost benefit and look at, obviously it's kind of a costly alternative, but there are the ecological benefits that do go along with it. Hannah? Sure, absolutely. The question was, I had pointed out in my maps that we have these kind of disconnected oxbow lakes on the property, and I had mentioned they were a good target for restoration and kind of why that was. I guess I was speaking more specifically to the Cold Harbor property, but I guess when we're looking at increasing our wetlands or increasing the sinuosity of our system, there are already these depressions in the land that match up really well with our channel. And so there's kind of limited work compared to other options that needs to be done there, because instead of potentially excavating a whole new flow path or trying to accumulate more surface water, that area is already there and water is actually already getting into that area. It's just there for a short time seasonally. And so kind of in terms of the effort of putting in these Beaver Dam analogs, we can have a lot of impact and we can really increase that residency time and really utilize that resource that's already there instead of like starting from scratch more so.
That's all the questions we have time for right now. Thank you.
Thank you. And Josh will be speaking next.
Hi, everybody. My name is Josh Wiese, and my master's project was to create a comprehensive bison management and research plan for both my community stakeholder and my employer, the Crane Trust. A little bit of information about the Crane Trust. The Crane Trust was established in 1979 or late 1978 to protect critical whooping crane habitat along the whooping crane's migratory corridor. And they protect about 8,100 acres in a landscape of largely agriculture, where there's been 96% of the tall grass prairie and meadow systems that have been converted over for agricultural use. A little background on bison natural history. So at the late 1700s, there was somewhere between 10 to 60 million bison that roamed North America and the Great Plains. By 1870, those numbers were reduced to just a few hundred. And those that were left in small isolated populations of people that basically brought in bison. And from that, our national park herds were born, thinking of things like or places like Yellowstone and National Bison Range. However, for a long time, those bison herds never got to mix their genetics. They stayed isolated. The loss of bison on the landscape was really significant, especially in grasslands, because grasslands evolved with a constant disturbance and reset effect of fire, drought, and grazing. And essentially, when you remove grazing from the system, it becomes oversimplified and loses habitat heterogeneity, which has trickle-down effects on all sorts of wildlife species. That's what's in the jar there. And one thing in particular that grassland managers do nowadays is that they've been using cattle and conservation cattle grazing to approximate the historic effects of bison. However, there's key differences in both behavior, moving patterns, and diet that differentiate bison and cattle, and these might have significant effects on the natural wildlife populations. One of these in particular is what's called wallowing. Wallowing is essentially a bowl-like depression that bison will create by rolling in the ground. And 1 year after reintroducing bison, let me back up. The Crane Trust reintroduced bison in 2015. They reintroduced 41. A year after they reintroduced bison, bison created a bunch of wallows on the landscape, and these cranes happened to find it. So the cranes found the needle in the haystack, bearing the question, are bison important to cranes? If you look at the historic bison range and the current range of whooping cranes that are in yellow and sandhill cranes that are in the kind of pinkish color, I guess, the overlap is significant. And bison were an ecosystem driver and engineer throughout pretty much all of the migration, breeding ground, and wintering grounds of both cranes. So the Crane Trust, after they reintroduced their bison, they expanded their range to about 1,100 acres, and the herd's grown to about 115 bison, which is essentially their carrying capacity. However, these ranges differ quite a bit in vegetation structure and vegetation type. So we have in the red a more uplandy habitat, and in the blue a more wetland, wet meadow system. So the Crane Trust reintroduced these bison. They had general ideas that they were going to reintroduce the natural processes that bison had on the landscape. And they also wanted to contribute to some national recovery or international recovery effort of bison as a species. And they've done great work up until this point to not only facilitate bison as a grazer, but also to publish a couple of scientific research articles relating to bison. But for my project, what really needed to happen is we needed to get all of our information together, figure out where the gaps in our current planning were regarding bison, and also help define what our long-term goals were for the bison. And so essentially what I did was organize a series of meetings with bison managers within the Crane Trust and try to gather as much information as we currently had on our bison herd and gather as much internal data that we had. We had things like weights and selling data and genetics data. And I took all this information and created a series of questions to discuss within these bison management meetings. And essentially my questions were geared towards decisions that weren't fully made yet or where major gaps lied within our decision-making process. In total, I had 220 meeting hours that the Crane Trust is dedicated to this, and then another 130 hours that the Crane Trust dedicated to allowing me the time to write this and then others to review it. Part of these meetings, one of the very first things I did was asked the Crane Trust management team to assess bison on 2 scales. The first was their capacity to manage biodiversity, and we used what's called the free scale. And looking at this, we find that our size of management units is a problem, not only that we have, but a lot of people that are trying to restore bison have. Essentially, that landscape's altered, fragmented, and there's not a lot left. Also, the disappearance of big predators is another limiting factor within our bison herd. However, some of the herbivory patterns, the fact that the soil and vegetation is still intact and never been tilled, puts us in a good position to manage these bison for biodiversity in general. Then I wanted to see how the crane truss bison fit within the context of bison restoration as a species. And some of our biggest limiting factors were, again, looking at herd size, which is limited by the amount of landscape we have, but some of our best opportunities existed within bison genetic management, the fact that bison were within the historic range, and that a lot of the ecosystem processes were still intact. I helped the crane trust develop a bison vision statement. I'm not going to read this due to brevity and time, but essentially they want to restore bison not only as an ecosystem driver, but contribute to the genetic, ecological, and cultural recovery of the species. I helped the crane trust team develop a couple clear goals: improve ecosystem structure and function, support the genetic recovery of the species, maintain bison well-being with limited human intervention, improve outreach and education efforts both for bison and for prairies, and develop strategies of long-term economic sustainability. Regarding ecosystem management, one of the first things we did was categorize the ranges that the bison are currently in and looked at priority management actions that needed to happen. So what did we need to do to manage the landscape in the way that we want to see it to go? Then the crane trust staff and I developed a list of priority species within the habitat and looked at the preferred habitat structure to which they seem to thrive in based upon the literature. And as you can see here, we have a mix of short to intermediate to tall habitat structures, which generally suggests that we needed to provide as many habitat types as we possibly could, and as many mosaics have been talked about already today, so I'm not going to belabor that. And then the crane trust was really interested in monitoring the reintroduction effort of bison and comparing how cattle grazing and bison grazing compared not only in the habitat, but also the response of wildlife. And what you can see here in this picture is the picture on the left is the last year bison or cattle were in this pasture, and the picture on the right was the first year bison were in this pasture. And we can already start to see that there's more flowering forbs out there, and the habitat structure, the structural height is more mosaic-y. So you have some tall patches and short patches, which should fit well with our species of concern. We would need to encourage the interaction between fire and grazing. Those were two major disturbance factors that contributed to resiliency within grassland systems. We need to open up our pastures and try to promote bison to freely move across the landscape. But we first need to control woody species encroachment and invasive species before we can actually realize free moving bison throughout the crane trust. Goal 2, support the genetic diversity of bison. This guy's got the right idea, except for the males, that doesn't work. But essentially, the crane trust has adopted a metapopulation strategy where they look at all these federal core herds and look to mix those genetics back together, keep them or de-isolate those genetics. And they've done pretty well so far. So if you look at conservation herds as a whole, so those are ones within the national park system, the crane trust's average number of alleles, so that's one way to look at genetic diversity of the herd, is approaching that upper end. And you can see we have representation from quite a few of the bison herds that are out there. But we can do better, and we feel that introducing new genetics through the form of introducing young bulls into the herd every couple of years will help. We also want to make sure that we preserve and keep our diverse genetics within our herd by keeping replacement heifers a couple every year, and then distribute our genetically diverse calves to other like-minded conservation organizations. I also did a review of the diseases of bison and then weighed out whether treatment was a better option to fight for bison well-being or whether to let natural selection happen. And then I gave a list of several suggestions and strategies to make that happen, minimizing the amount of human effort and intervention that we exhibit on our bison herd. I also compiled a list to improve outreach and education efforts using bison as a prairie ambassador to speak to the recovery of not only them as a species, but speak to the recovery and importance of grassland habitat. And then one of the biggest gaps that we had as an organization within the bison program was relations with indigenous cultures. And that was a key area that we need to look at growing. The last part is essentially I took national data on bison value of the meat and sales data from selling of our bison calves annually to try to look and see if the program's sustainable in the long term. And as long as we keep production, so the number of calves at a certain level, about 46 calves per year, so that means we have to have a pretty high female to male ratio, we're sustainable. So it's not no longer, or it's not a financial drag on the nonprofit. So some of the big conclusions coming out of this is that not only can bison be used and grazed to create diverse habitat types for our native species of concern, but also the fact that small conservation herds need to have a place in the say of what happens to bison as a species. They have potential to work as a living research laboratory to contribute new information about bison. And not only that, but we can contribute our knowledge, our genetics, and our values, and inspire other small conservation bison herds to do better and contribute to the health of the species. A few acknowledgments. I want to thank Madeline Vandekert for being my mentor and advisor and helping me stay motivated to get this done. I also want to thank Gary and Cass Petrock, who actually gave me funds as a match to an MEN fellowship. So thank you, the MEN fellowship. And then I want to thank the Crane Trust Natural Resource Team. They've been a family to me, especially Andy Caven, who was my community sponsor and has been my mentor for the last going on 8 years, and he's going to be leaving soon, so we're really miss him. And I need to thank my family, particularly my parents and my kids, for sharing me with the natural world and letting me explore this program. And that's all I got. I'll take questions. Go ahead, Chris. Okay. So the question is how are we, say the first part again, Chris, sorry. Okay, what are we recovering from? So what are we recovering bison genetics from? And then also how does the Crane Trust helping with that? Is that right? Okay. So again, when I talked about the genetic bottleneck, or I talked about the isolation, right? What happens with isolation populations is that the genetics become simplified and bottlenecked and less diverse over time. You have greater chances for things like inbreeding, and you lose that diversity. So that's the recovery. The recovery is reconnecting populations. And how is the Crane Trust helping? So not only are we reconnecting populations, but we really need to look at distributing our excess calves to people that are conservation minded, and that ensuring that our calves never make it to the slaughterhouse. They get a chance to breed and carry on those diverse genetics. Yes. Yep. Absolutely. So that's a good question. So we won't bring in bison without having genetics done on them. And when we go out to seek out new bulls to bring in, we're specifically looking either to people that got their bison from the national park or whatever, where we need those genetics from, or from that national park directly. Here. So there was less than 500. So interbreeding between bison or between cattle and bison? Yes. So there was a lot of inbreeding. There was, so you had these 500 and there may be 6 in one person's herd and 5 in another and 17 in another. And then when the National Bison Association stepped in, that was Hornaday and that was a couple other key players, Teddy Roosevelt, and they started restoring these. Some of the bison came, a couple from this herd, a couple from this herd, and then they went to Yellowstone, and a couple from this herd and a couple from this herd, they went to National Bison Range. So they started off with probably not super related genetics at the beginning, but then over time, inbreeding happens, right? And it's inevitable when you start with a small population, and those genetics bottleneck very quickly. And National Park Service just adopted a meta-population strategy, much like we have. And they showed within 200 years, bison will go extinct from bottlenecking if they don't start intermixing those genes.
Thank you. We have to enter the full panel Q&A now.
Cool, full panel Q&A.
To begin, we have a question for Chloe. Ingrid would like to know, how do the collars work and what was the longest migration pattern you found?
So the data I'm looking at comes from GPS collars, that there's kind of 2 different kinds. There's some that store the locations on the collar. So you get all the locations once you recover the GPS collar from the field. And then the more commonly used collars actually send locations up to a satellite, which beams the locations back down to the biologist's computer. And as for longest migration, I'm still processing the data, so to be determined.
So that was one of the things I didn't have enough time. Oh, the question was, have we had any issues of brucellosis in the bison herd? And short answer, no, but not having enough time to explain, the everything I reviewed. But basically what I did was I did a review of all bison diseases, and brucellosis was in there. But then I looked at diseases that maybe would affect our herd the most and what we need to be most concerned about. And Nebraska is technically a brucellosis-free state. So with that, that got it bumped that concern down a little ways. But there's new and emerging diseases like mycoplasma that's out there, and it's wiping out whole herds, or 80–90% of herds, when that arises, and they don't know much about it. So that's one of our biggest concerns right now. It's mycoplasma, not just for us, but as bison as a species.
Another question for Josh. Brett would like to know, how does your work fit into the mosaic of bison conservation herds across the country? And what does collaborative bison conservation look like for the Crane Trust?
That's a good question. So essentially that's what this project was to try to contextualize, where do we fit in? Where do other small conservation herds fit in? And we see our biggest gains because we can contribute to this genetics, this genetic diversification effort, as well as our ability to study and monitor these bison and their effects. And then the second part of that question, I'm sorry.
And what does collaborative bison conservation look like for the Crane Trust?
So for the Crane Trust, collaborative bison conservation looks like us going to places like conferences, sharing our research and what we've learned. It looks like potentially starting seed herd programs. So we take a small portion of our herd and help somebody else start a new herd. And it also involves co-management and working. Like I said, we have a lot of work we need to do with indigenous cultures and try to revitalize that cultural significance with bison and the sovereignty of indigenous First Nations. Yes, Jess. Go first.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah. So for each of us, what does, now that we've finished these projects, what does work look like going forward? And my boss, Andy, has always told me that your work becomes the problems that you solve. And I will be taking a very heavy role in the bison management program in the future, and then keeping up with my duties of assessing vegetation.
Yeah, that was a great question. I think the other part was like what we're taking with us. And so I think reflecting on my project, I really saw the value of collaboration, especially with pulling together this restoration committee. And I kind of had my process of going through and analyzing the data we had and coming up with my kind of best approach to solving this problem, but then really bringing in these experts and all these other voices was so incredibly helpful. And I think especially talking about land management and being place-based and people who've worked here and are really familiar with the ecosystems. And I'm going to be continuing on in land management, so I definitely look to apply those lessons in the future for myself.
So I would say my first order of business is finishing my project. But then I guess things that I'll take with me is I feel like throughout the course of this research, it's every time I feel like I learn something new, I come up with like 5 to 10 new things that I want to keep learning about. And so just kind of trying to answer some of those questions that keep coming up is what I would like to bring forward.
Relief is one.
Repeat the question.
Oh, yeah. So what the question was is now that we're kind of wrapping up our projects, what feelings are we having? And there's others in this room that are having a lot of feelings. And my first instinct is relief. And I was telling Jess earlier that I'm ready to get back to work. This has pulled a lot of effort and time out of my work day. And I've had to let some things slip through the cracks sometimes. But ultimately, I don't know, I'm pretty proud of where this project has gotten, and then the existential things that I've had to get through to get this thing done. So not pertaining to the project, not pertaining to work, it's the life stuff that can drag you down. So
I don't feel relief yet. Looking forward to that. But I am feeling right now really excited to be in this room with all of you people. And even though I'm not quite done yet, I'm ready to celebrate.
Yeah, I'll echo what both Josh and Chloe said. Definitely feeling that relief. And also a lot of excitement from just hearing about everyone else's projects. It's really neat to actually get to come together in person, and then just also feeling a lot of gratitude. As I mentioned, my project was pretty collaborative, and I'm really grateful for all of that.
We have time for one more question.
absolutely. Okay, so the question was how what are the differences essentially between cattle and bison that we're seeing, and would I recommend bison restoration on the landscape? And so a couple ones that show up in the literature. So there's anecdotal ones that I see, and then there's things that show up in the literature. And so the creation of wallows, bison can travel further away from water for longer durations, almost 3 times as far away for almost 3 times as long. So that creates less localized impacts and lets their impact be diversified throughout the landscape. Other things is bison can be on the landscape throughout the whole year. So 24 or 365 days a year, they can be out there. You don't have to bring them in to feed them through the winter time. They can sustain by themselves and actually reduce their metabolism through the winter to sustain themselves. And then there's other things like movement patterns and things like that that are key differences. So, but like I said, there's other things that we have to get a hold of as land managers before that's essentially a feasible possibility.
That's all for questions at this time. Thanks.
Thank you all, and thanks to this panel. And I encourage any of you who are feeling any nostalgia sinking in about leaving graduate school, that Chloe has set up an excellent model that you don't actually have to leave. You can stay for another year, get another degree, come talk to me about the employees program if you love big data, right, Chloe? Great big data stuff going on here. Folks, let's congratulate this panel one more time and join me in welcoming two new Masters in Environmental Management alumni and one continuing now with an MS in Ecology. So Katherine Bickley, please stand and be recognized. Josh Wiese, congratulations. And Chloe Beaupre, congratulations on your Masters of Science in Ecology.
So now we're going to introduce Kara, Lily, and Mal for their talk.